Season 6, Episode 1.
Oh, shoot.
This is Las Doctoras podcast with your favorite profas, Dr. Renee Limas
and Doctora Cristina Rose. Join us as we bring women and gender studies topics out of the university and onto the kitchen table. Salud! Bienvenidos!
Welcome to Las Doctoras podcast.
Season 6.
Season 6.
I know.
I can't believe it. Yeah. I feel like we were just, I don't know. Like, I don't even know.
Our littles are 8.
Mm-hmm.
We've been at this now for more than 6 years, but the podcast really,
Yeah.
And we're still friends.
Honestly, like that's a big deal.
Particularly with so much crossover with life, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But we are also just really, we still want to talk about some new things with you or some deeper things together, and then we want to share those conversations. We still
I feel like we're always like, oh, this is a podcast episode. We need to talk about this on the podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can give some life updates, but I also think that, like, we're still here wanting to have these conversations. I think, like, sometimes I think, are people still listening? Do they still really care? But we are still getting feedback.
I still get these lovely DMs sometimes that are just like, wow, thank you so much. And that just really, right, that's what really makes it also just renewed sense of
it reminds
how important
us
it is.
Yeah, it reminds us of like why we're doing this in the first place. And I think truly it still gives me an outlet. Like, times when I'm like, I need it, that's part of my process, both of like processing things emotionally, but also my creative and writing process is to talk things out. And so I think the podcast has always been so beautiful in giving us that platform to kind of talk it out. And then it serves a purpose beyond just ourselves, right? Like other folks can kind of feel that they kind of are part of that process too, right? Of talking it out.
I mean, truly, when we say this is a podcast episode, part of it is like, whoa, there's another one. But the other part I think is like, we got to talk about this.
Yeah. And that's how it's really important. We're like, we need to talk about it.
And also sometimes, on a drop off or a pickup of school, it's not the time to talk about it. Or we're not around the people that we actually do want to talk about it with, And so I think that's why. Also, sometimes it's like, wow, we interact with someone who's just amazing, and we're like, oh,
yeah,
we want to get to know you more, and
just feeling like, again, I think there's something to be said about the fact that we have a platform. Like in our last season, when we were talking about hiring practices in academia, and partially coming from, my experience, but also like we have this. I kept saying like, I've got a public platform to blast people when I need to, right? Like, but and I don't mean that in a negative way, because we're not the type to like call people out, unnecessarily. We're always trying to like, what are the systems that need to be called out?
Yeah, calling out the system, calling out the misinformation,
the higher thing that creates those things. But I think, but the truth is, we do have a platform, and I think this is where we can use it in these positive ways, because surely we're not the only ones that are experiencing these things, and so we can create some kind of conversation, give some context to all of these things, and thus we are using our platform in a way that's productive, and not productive in like some capitalist way, but like that's just gonna help us. I think ultimately we've always been about healing, right? Like, how do we make sense of all the different experiences that we've had in our life, so that we can get to a point of healing and just, I don't know, joy.
And sharing that wisdom and knowledge that we've gained over these 40 years, but particularly like in academic spaces, dismantling that ivory tower, and also sharing the wealth or the energy, right? Sharing the gifts of gifts,
Yeah.
the true gifts of what, we've learned, and passing them on so that it just doesn't stay insular,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that being said,
Yes.
I think we should do some updates. So, I mean, you've now been back. We've been back together in person. Not even, or has
January,
it been
9 months?
So 9 months. Oh my God. I'm like, I remember around this time last year, you started talking about it.
Yes.
And
yes.
we started kind of like, ooh, what does that look like? And
Yeah.
I just have to say, I love it so much. My life is so much easier when you're here. I think there was a part of me
that's so nice to hear.
that I'd gotten used to, like, you being gone. So I was kind of like, okay, and I was, I am kind of sometimes afraid of change. I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
But it's been really nice.
I know. I love how that, and I'm like this Gemini rising person who's just
You're
like, you're like, where, wait, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've been here now 9 months. We've been, I think, our kids are in the same school. We're now both involved in the school, which I also love. It's just always so nice to have supportive, parent, what's the word? Like support, right? Parent support in the school that we send our children to. So
that's where we met too. I think there's an understanding of what we value in that space, and we're in there and we're invested in it together.
And then I don't feel like I'm fighting my fights alone. Like anytime,
amen
of course
to
we're gonna
that.
be those like professor moms that are gonna have shit to say about things in our kids' school. But I feel like, I know that there's somebody that has my back, or I know that there's somebody who, kind of understands the dynamic, so then I can say like, what's your perspective on this, and we can really kind of be there for each other as we navigate this space for our children.
So much feeling of not aloneness in that. Thank you so much. That is how I felt so much in the last school, and I just it's like such a weight lifted that we don't, and that's something that we talk about a lot, the weight that we carry, feeling burdened or feeling responsible to do things, to make changes, and feeling quite alone in that sometimes. And that's a common theme for us. And the school is another example of it,
And we're also like, our kids are on the same soccer team. And I'm coaching.
Yeah. That fell together so interesting, Jaguar was like, I don't want to do soccer if I'm not like on a team with a friend. And I was like, okay, well then let's make it work. And then there was maybe not a team because there wasn't enough volunteers, and then
and I was like, I guess I'll coach.
Yeah.
But then I was like, do you want to be my team parent?
And I was like, what does that mean?
But honestly, I think because I was just texting you the other day that how much I love it. I do love coaching, but it still poses its challenge, and it's still a time commitment, and it's still, one more thing on my plate. And so it's like, I even, and that's why, because there was a couple years that both my kids had played soccer, and I had thought about it, and I was like, oh, I don't think I'm in a place to add one more thing. But I think it was so helpful when you came on, because it was like, oh, again, I'm not doing this alone. And so I can commiserate if I feel, a certain way, or, if I cancel practice, right? Like, it felt very much like, okay, I can do this if I don't have to do it by myself.
I love seeing you in your like kind of love of soccer. And I feel like I'm just like, what was that? Why was that a card, or what the heck? Like I'm just learning some of those things. And I love that our children are so happy together. And I love again, I think this is you stepping into something really important, and I can see you just really, it's so big in so many things for you, but also just real and grounded.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, we're in the beginning of October, so we're gonna head into November, into Dia de los Muertos, and it will also be my dad's 9th anniversary. Like that's
see these 9s. I love the 9
it's
months,
very
9
like
years. Yeah.
And so I think that soccer is something that connects my dad and I, and also because he was my coach, and I've always said that him being my coach and me playing soccer wasn't just about playing soccer, right? I learned so many life lessons in playing soccer. I was very much like a shy, kind of soft-spoken, reserved kid, and soccer really, partially because my dad pushed me to like out of my comfort zone, very much like pushed me out of my comfort zone and was like, I know your potential, I know you can do better. And so it kind of challenged me to step out of my comfort zone, to be more outspoken, to really stand my ground. And I learned so many life lessons in my journey in playing soccer. And so I always felt like that was what I would want to, that's what, for me, playing sports is about that. Like my kids playing sports is not just about, they happen to be talented in whatever sport that they're playing, but it's like, there's so many life lessons, I think, that I learned, and I know that Tommy learned in playing sports, that I don't know if we would be able to teach them in another way, just because that's the way that we learned. And so for me, that's what I'm, that's why I'm coaching, because I was like, oh, I know that there's a language I have around sports that I want to be able to pass on. And I very much, I mean, I can't tell you when I'm out there that I'm just like, oh, I'm not talking right now, this is my dad. Like straight up, I'll be like, oh, this is my dad talking. Like I can't explain to you how it very much feels like I'm channeling him, like I'm like, oh, this is, just even the way that I say things, or the way that I like kick the ball or whatever, like it very much feels like he's out there with me. So I think for me, it's like being able to be connected to my dad, and then also knowing that Santos, who didn't meet my dad, gets to still have those the gifts that he would have, passed on to him. And my brother and I, would talk a lot when I said, oh, I'm going to coach. And so my brother coaches soccer too. And the first thing he said to me was like, all you have to worry about is teaching these kids the beautiful sport that dad taught us.
Oh, this is so
He's like, that's all you're doing. He's like, you're just teaching them to love the sport that we were taught to love. He didn't say like, oh, you got to do this, and he was just like, you're out there to teach, especially because they're so young, right? Like we're not, I'm not coaching, professional soccer players here.
8-year-olds.
Yeah, they're 8-year-olds, and they're still trying to just have fun. And so he was very much like, that's what you want to have in mind. Like
I really saw just the kids on Tuesday practice. I just thought they were having a ball.
They were having a ball, and I'm like freaking out.
And so I think you're doing it. And number one, I love the gifts of like this is how your father will be remembered. This is his legacy. It's passing, like, embodied, like somatic, all that through you. And honestly, that is so beautiful. I just resonate so much with that, even with like simple things like taking Jaguar. My abuela's birthday was on the 29th, and we went to the Mexican market, went to Gonzalez, and we just did. And I felt I really resonate. I was like, oh, this is my abuela, like asking for the chicharrones right now.
Yeah.
And this is her, like, sharing them. And I'm really actually just very much connecting with that. And even in other aspects, like how our bodies help us integrate, in these lessons. I've learned that a lot this season, right? This 9 months with my leg and like coming into this place, like, and I'm really loving the words you used too, when you talked about, what was it, like engagement, empowerment, like I remember you shared this memory before. Your dad was like, get in there, like
he was always so frustrated, like, you need to be aggressive. And I'm, again, I was, as a child, I know it's easy to see me now as like this like super outspoken person, but I was very shy and very reserved as a child. And my dad would get really frustrated because he knew I would be more outspoken when I felt safe and when I felt like I was, loved. And so he saw that in me, and then didn't understand why that didn't translate onto the field. He's like, I know you can do it. And so he would get really frustrated. He's like, that was always his term. You need to get more aggressive or aggressive. And I was like, what does that mean? And it took me a long time until I remember it just finally clicked. And I was like, I would get in there, and I knew how to, in soccer, it's very physical. And like, I knew how to, and I was always short and small. So I knew how to push my body around, right? I didn't have the height. I didn't necessarily have the speed, but I could use what I did have and like get in there and like, throw some elbows. No, but like, And so it took, and again, it was the same in my life, right? Where it was like, oh, I can say what I need to say. I can be myself in the spaces, and I can feel like, aggressive in real life is assertiveness. Right? I can be assertive in this space, and I can I may not be as smart, I may not be as pretty, whatever, but I can use what I have to, say what I need to say. And so that's, to me, that was always the things that I translated. It was like, oh, soccer taught me how to be aggressive so that in real life I could be assertive,
I want to name that. I think Jaguar has really transformed actually in the last few months with soccer. Like I saw him kind of last year.
He's really good.
He was always kind of like, oh, I don't know how to get, and now he's like in there. He loves being a defender. He and then he used to just get in there and kick the ball and then run away. And now he like gets in there and stays in there. And so I love seeing him step into that. So he's such a physical kid solo kind of.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to see him like engage with his body like in like a sport, a team sport like that too. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that you're the coach.
Thanks.
Yes.
So I think we can kind of maybe shift gears a little bit and get into some of the themes that we've been really kind of mulling over for some time. And I think probably as we go into the season, these are some of the themes that we're going to be, I think, unpacking, deconstructing in all the different ways. Right.
The words that keep coming up for us again and again. As we shift into this, I was like, I want to go burn something, but I'm just seeing these candles. Do we have anything? Can we light something?
I don't have anything to. Oh, there's matches right there. Do you see the matches on the little box?
Yes. And can we light a candle or something to shift?
Yeah. There's some stuff right out there. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. I can cut some of this too.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean?
Do that too.
We can do the Palo Santo here.
I felt like we needed just a little bit of this. Wonderful.
Hopefully the fire alarm doesn't go off.
Oh, really?
Sometimes.
It's sensitive.
But it'll be okay.
Okay, I don't have to.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay.
So it's not so much. This is our little, cheers to season 6. And I think we can also be grateful for season 5. I think season 5 renewed our sense of purpose for what this podcast was for. And we're so grateful to all the wonderful guests who, reached out to us to want to be featured. And now as we enter into season 6, just, I think being open, like, let's just be open to what's meant to come,
Like we're gonna throw our weight around in a different way.
I'm just, I think at this point, so speaking of some of the themes, I think this partially coming out of your accident this year. I think me kind of still coming out of burnout from last year, both trying to, I think, find a sense of grounding, like how do we move forward after we've experienced physical, spiritual, emotional hardship. It's like, how do we, it's kind of like after we give birth.
It is so real. I literally was thinking these words as you were talking earlier, just like a minute ago. I was thinking grounding, untethered, like we're seeking our own, and it's and we know it's in us, but we know like it's of us, within ourselves, but within our for our kids.
And there's so much transformation, right? Because this is why it makes me think of birth, because I think, we're somebody before we have kids, before we give birth. And then after birth, we're trying to go back to that, the only version of ourselves that we knew, but then realizing, oh, we can't go back to those versions. Like we can't be just the same person. And so we have to find grounding in this transformed version of ourselves, which is like brand new territory.
And when all the narratives of society, to use birth as a metaphor, would say you should go back to that old body.
The new version of yourself should not be about yourself, but now it's about your kids. So you can transform, so binary, but you have to be self-sacrificing, right? You have to, again, coming from all those narratives, right? From our own, mothers, grandmothers, this idea of like, oh, once you have kids, that's it. You're done. Your life, anything that you ever wanted for yourself is no longer, right? And so now we're trying to find grounding in this new version of ourselves, wanting to maintain who we are, wanting to reject these old narratives. And so we are very much in like brand new territory that we have. We're like, what do we do? Right. And I think this is what we want to, one of the big things that we want to speak to is these narratives, right? And I came across this I think Instagram post one time, it used the term moral perfectionism. This notion that if we make a mistake, we're looking for, how do we, it's like, Catholicism, right? When we're supposed to go confess our sins and then we become pure again.
It's purity culture.
It's purity culture. We're we made a mistake. How do we get back to some pure sense of ourselves outside of that mistake? And then, but then we're human. And so we're always making mistakes. And so we're just in this perpetual cycle of trying to find some pure version of ourselves, when the reality is we just need to embrace our humanity.
Yeah.
And that we're going to make mistakes and that's okay. But it's so hard to, in the moment, you and I are so good at spiraling. But I think where we find healing is that because we're both aware of when we spiral, we can call each other and be like, hey, I'm spiraling. Can you help me?
I called you yesterday. I was like, yeah, moment. I need this, like,
Yeah.
And it was, I think that we are survivors of this moral perfectionism or purity culture, and so many things about yesterday I called you about was like, too, like, how can I embrace like that pain is okay? It's going to happen. Like mistakes happen, accidents happen, and in a world again that would like those all like just thinking about scars in particular right now is coming to mind, like how much money is spent on erasing scars. And the view of them as something that is,
ugly.
Totally. Yeah, I know. It's like I have these scars on my leg and I'm just trying to like embrace, and I'm thinking about getting these tattoos in order to do that, and I think that is a way of integration, instead of like somehow trying to,
because scars are proof that we're not perfect.
Yeah, human.
So when we look at the scar, we're like, the memory comes up and we're like, oh shit, remember that time that I wasn't perfect, right? And I think, scars is such a good like space to explore, because there's emotional scars too, right? That's what triggers are, essentially. Right? So when something happens and we're triggered, that's an emotional scar that we're like picking at, and we're like, oh shit, we haven't dealt with whatever that comes from, and I think so I've been working with my therapist a lot lately about doing shadow work. And I think there's a lot of talk about that, and like, what is that actually, like, what does that actually mean, right? And so we've been kind of trying to get very specific, like because shadow work is very vague, right? But like, what are the areas in your life that you need to look at, that maybe you're afraid to look at, that maybe show you your imperfections, and instead of trying to morally perfect your way out of them, to say, actually, let me look at this scar, let me stare at it, let me remember and sit with the feelings that it brings up and move through them, instead of trying to erase them.
These are like the parts of ourselves that we've marginalized, right? Or something like that. Like, or hidden,
we repressed, right?
And there's all these different metaphors for that, like on a shelf or tucked inside, you know. And so I think you're right. These are all kind of these taboo things that we're not meant to celebrate, you know, not meant to not meant to see the light of day, you know. And
it's the dirty laundry.
So good. I love it. I love it.
Right? I mean, because
it's the dirty dishes, right?
It's the messy house.
Yeah.
We're supposed to, right? Because when people come over, we have a messy house. What do? We shove everything in a closet and close the closet, and then everything just looks perfect, even though everything's just tucked into a closet.
I got a messy closet. Let's just be real.
My mom, you know, because my mom is very much a neat freak, but then you go into her garage and you're like, this.
She's talked to me about the garage though. Like, I think she would say it's all you and your brother's things.
This is what she says, and I'm like, okay. Which is funny because we've been taking all our stuff out, and I'm like, there's
totally
stuff in here.
Oh, I love
it. That's projection.
Oh,
right?
Totally.
That's
so much.
That generation.
I love how that's particular when she's.
Oh yeah, she'll say like, "Oh, it's mostly yours." So I'm like, my mom's got a shelf of like gift baskets, and I'm like,
"Oh, you should use those for the fair."
But I'm like, "Why do you need this many?
These to the harvest fair?
Why do you need this many gift baskets?" You know, and like I'm like I see them in the corner of my eye every time. I'm like, maybe if we got rid of all these, you'd have some space. But anyway,
we continue to do mother work. We continue mother healing.
That's also shadow. I mean, that's part of our shadow work is right, like dealing with the conflict of, you know, of the conflicts that we have with our mother. Because who wants to really dive into that? You know, we kind of want to just either say I don't want to deal with it at all, or like let's just have this like superficial relationship and not have to really like dig deep into and that's what shadow work is, right? And so
I mean, how many times would we like do we actually want to like go into like, you know, spotless mind stuff or like ignorance is bliss? I mean, there is. So I feel like we should give this qualifier here. I do it in all my classes, you know. I was like, you listen to us, there's no going back, you know. You're taking the blue pill or whatever, the red pill, you're gonna see that we're, you know, like, and there are lots of times when we would like to suspend, you know, or like a willing suspension of disbelief, you know, kind of.
I think I've heard the term like masking, you know, and I think this is, I don't know, maybe it's a like psychology word or something, but this idea of that we put on, I think it's, I hear
Ansel Lewis speaks to this, right?
Yeah. And I hear it in the realm of like folks who have like autism or ADHD where they're able to kind of perform.
Ooh, yes. The performativity of
things. Like they're able to perform this, but then in the safety of their own house, they're like, I'm just gonna be myself. And so it's not really actually, you're not really actually changing your behavior, you're just masking it, right? And I think that you and I,
we're good at that. Or we were good at that.
Well, you and I, why are we academics? Why did we seek out educational success or success in the realm of education? Because we knew how to mask real good in those spaces. That was our I mean, you know, that's the way I see it. I'm like, there was a lot of other spaces that I didn't feel comfortable in, or that I was like, but I know how to perform in an academic space.
A lot of performing, right, is even mask wearing, it's knowing which one to wear in which situation, editing, all these different things. And so it's reading the room. It's like a survival skill, right? We're really good at reading our audience. So like a lot of the academic like strengths were because we could read the teacher and know what they wanted, you know. And now we're trying to not do these things, and it's terrifying.
It's
actually terrifying. Some of the questions are like, even as we started now, I was just like, how long can we keep this going? Like, you know, because
it's imposter syndrome stuff of like, when is somebody going to realize that we're just full of shit?
I mean, but the thing is, everyone is full of shit.
Everyone is full of shit. Yeah.
And we're just, you know, you're on this journey with us of unmasking of, you know, of, and I actually think performing, you know, as we perform, you know, it's,
But I think that I actually think that this is why the podcast our podcast in particular has been so successful, whatever you want to call it. I think because we actually are trying to use this platform as a way to unmask and be our authentic selves, because we know, you and I know, we've always said this, that we're just turning the mics on conversations that we would have anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think that, yes, there's always going to be that performativity, because at this point it's so ingrained in us that it's hard not to do that. Yeah. But I think our intention is always be like, how can we bring our most authentic self to this podcast, and let's just talk in the way that you and I would talk to each other normally. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that.
I think we have. I think turning on the video was the next
step. That was.
And now I'm just like, okay.
Oh yeah. That's why I think maybe that's why I try not to look at myself. I'm like,
yes. But I think it's that vulnerability that, that making transparent, things that is something we want to offer. Like, we feel like we should, like
well, I think we like to be people. I always say we like to feel like we're walking the walk, right? I think it's very easy to talk and say certain things. And I think we've always been really clear of, like, I mean, sometimes to the point of like, we're hyper vigilant. Like, we have to make sure that we're staying, like, we're very much about integrity. I will say that, like,
I will say, I think the moral perfectionism plays a part in that too.
Probably. Maybe it's not integrity, maybe it's perfectionism.
Well, I think it's probably a mix. That's the thing. That's the complexity of it. I think we're both part of us reading the performing and was integrated with moral perfectionism, because we knew we had to work so hard in order to, achieve things in a classist, racist, sexist world, so
and I think so, because in my last session with my therapist, shout out to my therapist, Maritza. Maybe I shouldn't say her last name.
Anyway. I was like, I don't know.
But anyway, we were talking about, I've been sort of in this place where, like, this year, whether I was a conscious thing or not, like, I'm really stepping into being unapologetic. I know, believe it or not, I do censor myself. So, because, and so I think I have been being unapologetic, but then I immediately regret it. So I'll like be in a space where I'll be like, I'm going to say what I want to say. And then after, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. Why did I say that? Are they going to think I'm like, and I start to go into my head about it, and I start to second guess myself, and I start to beat myself up about, like, what did I say, and how did I say it, and how could it be misconstrued, and all of those things, and it literally keeps me up at night. And so I've been trying to talk to my therapist about it, and she's like, and we were talking about okay, so that's a shadow, right? This the perfectionism of that, right? And because I was like, yeah, sometimes when we do our podcast, I said, I don't listen to it again. I just put it out. And you sometimes will listen to it again. I'm like, oh my God, that scares me. Like, I don't want to listen to it again. And so she was like, okay, you have to. So how do you face that shadow? And she's like, you need to listen to it.
Really?
She's like, but don't listen to it before you put it out. Put it out and then listen to it.
That's smart. I can hear another therapist of ours, Sylvia, say, you're trying to control, you know, and that you can't, and but I love that. I love that you need to listen to this after we put it out.
It's just the sort of the shadow of self-doubt, right? The shadow of like the hypervigilance of like, oh, we need to make sure that we curate what we say, how we say it, anything that we present to the public in a way that nobody can find fault. Why do we not post on social media a lot? Because we are too perfectionist. We are so afraid to put something out that might get negative feedback or that, you know what I mean? Like, we're so afraid to put ourselves out there that we would just rather not to. I mean, yes, there's logistical, like, time issues that, but I do think
it's somewhere there. I do think we're trying to figure out, and you've heard this all too, like, where to put our energy in places that it will like kind of this mutual, thing. I think doing the podcast, honestly, I think we both lean towards in different ways, like that OCD or that kind of overthinking, and certainly because we've been so good at performing, when we choose not to, we have some PTSD afterwards, and I think we both do that. And I think by doing this together, it allows us to have a shared vulnerability.
Yes.
And so then we're not alone, and we can listen to it and talk about it.
Yeah, totally.
Instead of just the monkey mind kind
The
of
shared
in
vulnerability.
our mind over and over again.
The shared vulnerability is huge because I feel like for a very long time in my life, and I think many of us, right, we have intrusive thoughts, right? Or we have these like catastrophizing, right? We're like, oh my God, we can never talk to anybody about this because they're gonna think I'm crazy, or they're gonna think I'm weird, or they're gonna be like,
I love it when you share this.
And so then I'll tell you like my
worst
case scenarios. And this is the thing that I love so much. And you'll be like, yeah, I get it. I understand how you got to that. And I'm like the calmness in which you react when I say what I perceive as like the craziest thing that I could come up with. And I'm like, oh, like just that reaction alone makes me feel good, because I'm like, oh, so I'm not crazy for thinking it.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
just that alone allows the intrusive thought to kind of a little bit like, does that make sense? Like,
yeah. We have this great book with Jaguar we read called Ruby Has a Worry. And I think we've read it before together. I've shared it with you, but her worry is so small and then it gets so big, and she just needs to talk about it with someone. And then it kind of doesn't mean the worry won't come back.
Yeah.
But it has just like not been given that other power. And I think that's what happens to shadow aspects of ourselves. If they're not seen, they take over. They can take over. They become, I would argue, like our demons, right? Like and there's a great, I think it was a book called Feed Your Demons too. Like it was like, how do we like recognize our shadows and celebrate
and it
them
makes
as part of ourselves.
It makes me go back to when we talk about, or Coatlicue, right? So Coatlicue in Mexica mythology is the mother of gods and goddesses, right? And I would even say there's probably non-binary terminology, right? And I think even Coatlicue, right? Because
English does not help us,
right? Exactly. There's no, but I think indigenous terminology, they did have all this expensive knowledge. But anyway, so I think when we think about Coatlicue, and there's so much duality in her, right? So she represents life and death, recognizing that it's a cycle, right? It's not linear, right? She represents good and evil, right? And even evil is not really the word for it, right? It's light and darkness, but again, not in this
hierarchical dualistic way. It is like they are yin yang. They are one and the same,
yes.
Yeah.
And I think that when we talk about moral perfectionism, it's us trying to be just the light, trying to be just the good, and the shadow is our other side that through white supremacy, capital, blah 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 blah, has taught us to like, we have to, the shadow is evil. If we allow the shadow in, we're gonna be evil, right? And we're not gonna this is the narrative that's always in my head. I don't deserve to experience joy if I'm not perfect. And so I have to like literally tell myself, I deserve to experience joy even if my life is not perfect. Like I will literally tell myself that in my head. I deserve to experience joy even if my life is not perfect, right? And so I think I've been really trying to say like, oh, the shadow isn't about overcoming the shadow or overcoming these things. It's integrating. It's like, oh, this is just a part of me. So me having self-doubt when I say things, that's just normal human. Maybe it comes from being rejected in different times in my life, right? So it's like integrating that the shadow into us. It's not about facing it so then we can get past it. It's like facing it so it becomes a part of us and it doesn't trigger those spiraling feelings, right? Where we can see an intrusive thought and be like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe more neutral. Like, I mean, I don't know, but I think that where I'm at is to really lean on that notion of duality, multiplicity, and that, we can never all be all good.
Yeah.
And that even bad is not the term, right? It's just human, right?
It's not perfect.
It's not perfect, right?
Yeah.
And mistakes, right? Like that's just a part of life.
To treat it otherwise is kind of it's like the ultimate OCD, having to do things in a certain way every time in order to be safe, kind of things. It makes me think of the story that you shared this morning, the one that you learned about having to pray every night, or else
so my grandmother used to tell me this. I can't even it was a story about somebody who maybe had a hard time remembering to pray every night. But then she, this person, this one night made sure that they prayed, and then there was a fire, and this was the only person that survived the fire.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I was a little girl hearing that, and it's stuck with me. So I always made sure that I prayed at night, even if I was tired, even if I was, and I had to pray perfectly.
Oh, yeah.
I had to, there was this OCD of this order of which I had to say my prayers. And if I didn't finish it, then it didn't count.
I mean, such a scarcity mentality, right? That, that God or the world, goddess, whatever, is so scarce. The abundance is, there's no, that you would have to do all these things, I feel that too, it makes me think of that one story that I was telling you about, this other world where people were trained or bred to be be geniuses with OCD, so that they would be both gifts and also not unable to live their lives fully because they had to follow the lines in the floor for so long, or they had to twist that doorknob so many times, or pray this exact prayer every night, but we live in a much more abundant world than that, right? And so that's it too. We don't need to be robots in order to make things work.
And I think this is a religious thing of, at least Christian Catholic, right? Of if something, this comes back to even when we talked about, you're breaking your leg. It was like, if something bad happens to you, it's because you did something wrong.
Yeah.
And therefore you deserve to have that happen to you because you didn't follow the right perfect pathway, right? And so this is where I think the OCD comes from. It's like, well, if we can keep everything in line in this specific way, then nothing bad will ever happen and we'll be okay.
Yeah.
And so we get more obsessed with keeping the things in alignment rather than just enjoying life and realizing accidents are going to happen no matter what.
So big. It's so big. I feel like it's connected to this story that I wanted to share, but I don't know how. I feel like, I heard a story growing up too around basically how one had to sacrifice their most beloved thing in order to save the world, or something like that. And I feel like that really resonates with me. Should I tell the story?
Yeah,
Is it really weird? So
No.
growing up in church, we were told this story about this mechanic who controlled the bridge, that people pass under, for ships to go through. And so, but one day he brought his kid to work, a son, right? And when he was meant to bring the bridge up so this passenger ship could come through with all these hundreds of people, his son was on the gears, and in that moment he had to choose between sacrificing his son, killing his son to open the bridge, or keeping the bridge shut so his son could live and the passengers could come through, or they would die, basically.
He had to pick between his son and hundreds of people.
Yeah. This was their way of trying to help us understand why God had to sacrifice his only son, Jesus, or that other biblical story in the Old Testament, where the Ishmael or Isaac or something like that. And I just think that plays a part here, so much that performativity and moral perfectionism, sometimes I think the world will not be okay, right? If I do not even just perform in a certain way, but sacrifice like myself and like the things that I love.
Yeah.
And I think it goes that deep, like
Yeah. I mean, that's a big story, and I still think that still doesn't make it make sense to me.
Well, because right, it's so scarce. It's just like
that's one of those things that like people will say like, oh, if you were, falling off a bridge, who would you save, your mom or your husband? You know what I mean? It's so it's like those are impossible choices that like and how often are we actually going to be in those dire, it is scarcity, right? Like those dire situations, right? Like which is interesting because then when we think about capitalism,
yes,
and capitalism is very much about the individual, and it's so fascinating how Christianity weaponizes that for moral perfectionism, but then does not see it the same way when it comes to collectivism, right? Like it demonizes the notion of collectivism as like, oh, that's socialist. Like it's very convenient, right? It's these convenient narratives that they use to shame us, but then also maintain power.
It is so real. When I was in the abusive marriage, my ex would say like, would you love me, or if there was a fire, would you choose me or your parents more? And honestly, to me, again, this person was really just like the incarnation of like all this religious like dogma, like
that's a fucked up question.
Oh, it's so, I was like, and neither. There's no fire, And the thing is, like,
there's no fucking fire. Like, calm down.
This is like, I think this is like white savior complex too. Like, who are we trying to save? Like people from, and white male saviorism, white men. Like it's saying like there's a world that exists outside of these scarcity stories. But they were the ones that I think really like raised us. Even the stories we heard in school that like completely marginalized and oppressed people's stories. So if we didn't even hear them, right?
Yeah.
That it's just, it continually has to come out. It continually has to just be like, not live in our brains anymore, like not live in our bodies, like bring them out. And so,
well, it's, I think, why I think I thought it was important for you to share that story is because when we deconstruct when we're looking at our shadows and trying to integrate them, we have to be able to say, well, where do these feelings come from? Like, why do I feel this way about something? Sometimes it's something so silly that triggers us, and we're like, why are we having this huge emotion about this very small thing? And then we start to do the work and trace it back, and we're like, oh, because we were told these crazy stories about like we had to sacrifice ourselves or we had to do things perfectly. And so once we can figure out where they're from and then extricate the narrative, then we can integrate the shadow.
That's the
right.
That's the work, right?
That's the
journey. That's the process. It is interesting that story came to me, and when our stories come to us, as I was like, bringing my kid home from the urgent care, like, where, I love it. I feel like actually this is kind of exciting and scary. Like, I'm like, why would that come up? Like, where,
it's very scary.
But
I mean, I think we've done that a lot. Like when we first talked about our student loans, when we talked about like body image, like we've kind of done that all along of like talking about these very scary things that we don't really like to publicly be vulnerable about how, where we're at on that journey. And I think this is just this next level of like, really trying to integrate our shadow selves and if y'all knew what we spiraled about.
So I hear that season, like shadows, moral perfectionism, performativity, and
narratives and stories that we were told,
that often have some religious like kind of background, but not always. And so we'll be deconstructing some of these narratives for what they are.
Maybe we're in our deconstruction era, right? Isn't that what people say?
I was like, is that all the eras we've been in? No,
I don't know. I know if we had to trace our seasons, it'd be interesting. But so yeah, I mean, I think that for this season, our intention is to kind of just be open to where it's taking us, recognizing that we are on this journey of trying to, face our shadows, integrate our shadows, trying to unpack how moral perfectionism impacts us, trying to unpack how these stories and narratives have hurt us, and how they still live in our lives in so many ways. And I think, always we've said this, and sometimes I'm like, we say this, but are we actually doing it? But I think it's one of those things where we need to say it so we can keep having that be our goal. Is we want to feel joy. We want to just have fun and feel, liberation, right, is about joy. And we need to do the unpacking, but we also need to just have fun. And that's always what we have our eye on, I think. And
I'm thinking like the word regulation, self-regulation or community regulation has come up for, like, we want to come back to that, embrace the cycles of things, embrace the feelings, embrace them for our children. So when they're like having a meltdown, we can be like, I hear you. Your feelings are real. I believe you. And like, that's
girl,
I believe you. I'm like, and we're going to work through this.
We're going to have to do another parenting episode, because they're so like, I feel like our kids, our youngest are probably going to be in their 9-year change, and then my oldest is going to be in his 12-year change.
They're in their 9-year change. They're really feel like, or I can feel that.
I can feel Cruz is 12 and he's not even 11 yet, and I'm like, he's very much about like, you're not hearing me. And I'm like,
I love it. And then we can break down these. I would love to hear conversations about the 9-year and 12-year change.
Yeah. Too. Oh yeah, we'll talk about that.
But the joy, just to say, like, regulation, hearing feelings, I believe you. We're going to work this out. We're going to work this out together, and so that we can be like freaking present and just like with our kids, in their joy and their
allow ourselves
with ourselves
to have a good time. Like, go and have a date together where we can go get a pedicure and just be happy. Like, we don't always have to be doing shadow work, 24/7.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing too, isn't it? Yeah, it's a part of like workaholic labor. Labor
which goes back to perfectionism. I know, right? Like,
okay, well, we can keep going on that.
We can go in circles. All right, so
thank you.
We're excited for season 6.
We have some people in the works, some some guests who've reached out, and then we have a lot of things I think that we need to dive back into and talk about. It sounds like
so we look forward to another great season, and follow, subscribe, listen, give us a review, send us a DM. Alrighty.